Well, welcome to everybody today, and to our November CVRS of Alberta, Canadian Vintage Radio Society of Alberta meeting. And as you all know, it's a very special event called the Fessenden Connection, and we're very privileged and honored to have as guests today the Fessenden family, Bob and his lovely wife Doreen. We are going to carry forward the presentation in maybe about 2 or 3 parts. And the first one will be a video presentation of some of the high points of Reginald Fessenden's tremendous contribution to radio development and history with the original broadcast that was made in audio and voice and music transmission way back at the beginning of the 20th century. 1906 exactly, I guess, was that transmission. So you'll see a half-hour video presentation of that part of his life especially. We apologize that the resolution of the video is not as great as we would have hoped. We tried to get in touch with, I think it's the National Film Board who's responsible for its production, trying to get a better copy, a high-res copy. We couldn't do it. And so we'll proceed with what is in effect from YouTube. And so if you want to review this presentation later and have another look at it, just go to YouTube and search under Reginald Fessenden, and you'll come up with it, as well as on the site fessenden.ca. You'll see the same presentation. So that'll occupy about a half hour of our time, and then it'll be a pleasure to introduce Bob Fessenden to the podium, and he'll give us more of the background of the Fessenden family history and that of Reginald. And there will be a final maybe 15-minute portion for question and answer that will give you an opportunity to ask him whatever questions might be of interest. So we'll proceed ahead with the video presentation first. A very interesting and moving story in many ways. Of course, that's a very small part of the history of Reginald, and he went on to, I think, have something like 500 patents ascribed to his name. He's a prolific inventor and a great scientific mind and a tremendous radio pioneer for Canada and its history. As I mentioned before, we're privileged today to have with us the Fessendens, and we're going to invite Bob to come to the podium and to give us a few inside views and history of the Fessendens and also of Reginald. He'll have some comments to make on the presentation itself, I understand. But just as a brief introduction and a bit of bio for Bob's background, let me just mention a short history. This is our first time to meet him and his wife, and so Bob's history, education-wise, I guess goes back to 1967 when he took a degree in forestry sciences, and thereafter, I guess in fairly quick succession, went on to earn his master's and his PhD in microbiology. That at the University of, let's see, was it Guelph? And thereafter taught, I believe, in university courses, the sciences that he had become capable of and proficient in for about 11 years. He went on from there to get into private industry with a appointment as a terrestrial environment section leader for Syncrude Canada for a number of years, and then went on to involve himself on the government side of science research and development, serving as head of the Soils and Terrain Sciences Department, Vice President of Natural Resources and Resource Technologies, and as President of the Alberta Science and Research Authority in 1995. He served in a number of positions, serving as Deputy Minister of Alberta Economic Development for the Government of Alberta, and looking after the departments of Sustainable Resources, Innovation and Science, and Advanced Education and Technology. I think his final appointment was that of Deputy Minister of the Premier's Council for Economic Strategy, that taking place in 2008. So Bob has had a long and illustrious career himself. And since that time, he has settled in the Edmonton area in Sherwood Park and has devoted himself to some historical studies and writing. So it's going to be a pleasure to welcome him to the front and to give us his opinion on the Fessendens.
Well, thanks, Murray. Really a pleasure to be here today. And you know, I was thinking that had there's something interesting about having an unusual name. You know, if Reginald had been named Smith, I probably wouldn't be here today. But when you have an unusual name, it's possible to trace things a little bit more, and so that's what gives rise to this. You know, the video is a powerful video, and it's reasonably faithful to the written record, although it would have you believe that the injunction that Fessenden was served with came immediately after that Christmas broadcast. In fact, there was a gap of 4 years. The Christmas broadcast was in December of 1906, and he was served with that injunction really in, the process started in sort of just after Christmas in 1910, and he was served with the injunction in 1911. And that really didn't come through very clearly. The other thing that it's not faithful about is the cat's name was actually Mikeums, not Mike. Now, I don't know why they changed that, but that's kind of piece of trivia. Anyway. But I'd like to begin by thanking you, Murray, and really all of you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon and to look forward to speaking to you a little bit about the family. With regard to my Fessenden surname, there are two questions that I get asked quite routinely. The first is, what kind of a name is that anyway? Is it German? Is it Scandinavian? You know, kind of what is it? And secondly, are you related to Reginald Fessenden? Those are two questions we've been asked quite a bit. So I'll answer those, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the family history, kind of where Reginald's family, how they came up to Quebec, and how he got involved in what he was doing. And so just bear with me a little bit. So Fessenden is a name from England. It's a family name derived from a place name, and it's one of a family of names that come out of the southeast part of England that end in E-N-D-E-N, but with different prefixes. And essentially what it means, the E-N-D-E-N ending means a clearing in the forest or a pasture, a forest pasture. But the prefix signifies ownership. So for example, there are names like Bassenden, Ovenden, Crittenden, Wolfenden, Rothenden. There's probably several dozen of those kinds of names that end in E-N-D-E-N but have a little different prefix. There are also towns in southeast part of England, towns like Benenden, Missenden, Baxenden, Biddenden, and those are places again that are derived from this idea of a clearing in the forest. So, for example, in the southeast part of England, there's a town called Biddenden, not in the county of Kent, which is said to mean the woodland pasture of a man named Bidda. So Fessenden probably means the woodland clearing of a man named Fess, or something that sounds a bit like that. And the reason they're not very common names is because these were very small places, and most have disappeared in antiquity. But we do know that the name is an Anglo-Saxon word, hence the Germanic sound to it, and it comes from very near to Canterbury. And certainly we know that the family came to North America in the 1600s from the Canterbury area, and there are Fessenden gravestones in some Canterbury churchyards dating back to the 1200s. So that's where the name comes from. So am I related to Reginald Aubrey Fessenden? Yes. Am I descended from Reginald? No. Reginald and his wife Helen had just one child, Reginald Kennelly Fessenden, and he had no descendants. Our common ancestor was Nicholas Fessenden, who was born in the Canterbury area of England in 1650, and who died in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1719. And my wife and I have been down to the old burying ground in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is just about 100 yards north of Harvard Square. And we've seen the gravestone there, and that's our common ancestor. However, Nicholas wasn't the first Fessenden to come to Canada. That honor belongs to his uncle John and John's wife Jane, who came over in the 1630s as part of the great migration of Puritans out of England, just leading up to the Civil War in England. And they settled in the original Cambridge settlement. And John Fessenden was a tanner and a glover, and he built up an estate there, but he had no children. And so he sent over back to England for his nephew to come over. That was Nicholas. And he came over, I said, in about 1670, when he was about 20 years of age. And he married in Cambridge, and he and his wife had 14 children, 11 of whom survived to adulthood, 6 of whom were male, and led to branches of the family. So when you see the name Fessenden in North America, we're probably all related, and we all come from that one individual who came over about 300 years ago. So if genealogically speaking, I'm a 5th cousin 3 times removed, which is why I say a distant cousin. What I normally say, because that's an eye glazer, what I normally say is I'm a distant cousin with a common ancestor who died about 300 years ago. Now, having said that, Reginald really has no close relatives. All of his brothers had no male descendants that keep the line alive on his side, and Reginald himself just had the one son who died without children. So you wouldn't find very many close relatives to Reginald, so a 5th cousin will just have to do. When I was growing up in the Toronto area, I was essentially unaware of Reginald. It was in 1967 that I was sort of first confronted with my lack of knowledge. My wife and I were married in August of 1967, and by accident, we honeymooned in Bermuda for a week. Now, Bermuda is, of course, sometimes thought of as part of the Caribbean. In fact, it's off the Carolinas, about 600 miles off the Carolinas. And when we got off the plane in Bermuda, we were greeted by somebody from the Bermuda tourism industry who called us by name and asked me if I was related to Professor Fessenden. And of course, I didn't have a clue who she was talking about. And so I sort of stumbled a little bit and said, well, I suppose so. And that was a missed opportunity, I think, because we might have been treated to something. But in any event, that was what kind of got me going in terms of an interest in Reginald. There were 2 other things. In 1972, this 2-volume set of books called The Fessenden Family in North America was published. And anybody who they were aware of, the people who put this together, anybody they were aware of received this 2-volume set. So a lot of my knowledge of the genealogy comes out of these. And then about the same time, I became aware of the book by Ormond Rabbie. This was published in 1970, but we sort of became aware of it in about 1974, 75. And this, how many of you are familiar with this book? Many? Oh, it's called Radio's First Voice, The Story of Reginald Fessenden. And it's a great source of information that, if you can acquire a copy, it makes a good read. There's elements of historical fiction in this, in the sense that he invents some dialogue between Reginald and his uncle, and Reginald and other people. But it is a good source of information. So I'll leave them here afterwards if you want to have a look at them. But it was Reginald's great-grandfather, Ebenezer Fessenden, that brought Reginald's branch of the family up into Canada. Ebenezer was born in Massachusetts in 1775, just at the onset of the American Revolution. And his move up to the eastern townships of Quebec as a 25-year-old single man was really more about economic interest rather than escaping the revolution, because his older brother actually served in the Revolutionary Army, but his older brother inherited the family farm, and Ebenezer was one of the younger males, and so he went looking for opportunity. But he married up there in about 1800 and raised a family. So that was his great-grandfather. His grandfather, one of the oldest sons of Ebenezer, actually married an Eastern Townships girl, because they were just north of the border up in the Eastern Townships of Quebec. And after he married her, he moved the family out to Michigan. And there they had about 4 or 5 children, 4 children actually. And then he died young at the age of 42. And so he left his widow with 4 children. His widow was pregnant at the time. And she very quickly moved back to the Eastern Townships. So in fact, his grandmother Fessenden raised the children back in the Eastern Townships, even though they'd been in Michigan for a little bit. Now, of the children that were born in Michigan, the oldest was Reginald's father, Elisha Joseph Fessenden, and the youngest, the one who was born actually after the father died, was Cortez Fessenden. And he is the one that is credited with really interesting Reginald in science and technology and nurturing his interest, because Cortez Fessenden was a teacher of mathematics and physics in high school level. And he was also familiar with the work of Alexander Graham Bell and was privileged actually to see a demonstration of the telephone in 1876 in Brantford, because he was in a town close by in Brampton. And he saw the demonstration, and he came back and he explained that to Reginald, who was a young boy at the time in Fergus. And apparently that had a big impact on Reginald's interest in voice. As I say, Rabbi invents some dialogue here, and he says, as Cortez is explaining this to Reginald, and Reginald at this point is about 8 or 9 or 10 years old, he's talking about voice coming over a wire. And Reginald says, well, why do you need a wire? Why can't you just do this? You hear thunder, you see lightning. Why can't you do it without wires? No, I'm not sure that's a real dialogue, but it makes a good story. So coming back to the story then, Reginald's father was educated at McGill, and he then took clergy training at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, and took his orders from the Church of England and became a minister. And he started off his ministry in the Eastern Townships and was there from 1865 to 1872, which was a really interesting period in Canada. This was the end of the Civil War and the just coming up into Confederation in 67. And if you read anything about the history, particularly the border towns, they were pretty close to the American border, there was an awful lot of unrest and worry that in fact Canada might get annexed to the U.S. People were worried about the soldiers after the Civil War coming up and annexing Canada. The Fenian crises that you may know a little bit about. But this was all a period of unrest at that time and in that period. In any event, Reginald was born in October of 1866, so a year after the end of the Civil War, a year before Confederation. That was the period in which he was born. They lived in the Eastern Townships till about 1872, then they moved to Fergus, and eventually they moved to the Niagara Falls area, where Reginald's father had a couple of churches over quite a period of time. Maybe say something more about Reginald's mother's side here. I'll come back to her a little later on, but maybe say something about that. Her name prior to marriage was Trenholm. The last name was Trenholm. And her parents, primarily her grandparents, had come over to the Eastern Townships from Yorkshire in 1820, and they must have come with some money because they built lumber and grain mills, and their son, Edward Trenholm, who was Clementina's father, is said to have possessed many qualities that he passed on to his grandson. He was easily aroused to anger over the shortcomings of others, and we saw that illustrated, but once having vented, did not hold grudges. And he was an inventor who patented and was credited with the modern grain elevator, the grain cooler, and the snowplow. However, 2 disastrous grist mill fires in quick succession wiped out his fortune, and he died young at the age of 55, less than a year before Reginald was born. It was said that his death was brought on by overexertion during a demonstration of the snowplow. So it sounds like he maybe had some heart issues, and we'll come back to that too. So coming back to Reginald then, when the family moved to the Niagara Falls area, Reginald, at the age of 9, obtained a scholarship from DeVoe Military Academy on the U.S. side of the border. And 2 years later, in 1878, at the age of 11, he entered Trinity College School in Port Hope, which is where ministers' sons could get reasonably inexpensive tuition. Now, a few years ago, Doreen and I, when we were on a trip to Peterborough, Ontario, to visit Doreen's sister, drove down to Trinity College in Port Hope, because it's a short drive down, and discovered that they actually had designated a part of the school, a wing of the school, as the Fessenden wing. Following his graduation from Trinity in 1883, he took a mathematical mastership at Bishop's College School, which was his father's alma mater in Quebec. And in the 83-84 school year, the year that he turned 18, he was teaching mathematics at a high school level while simultaneously studying with older students at Bishop's University. So clearly precocious. In addition to his teaching and formal studies, he took up Hebrew, Arabic, and Sanskrit on his own. The next 2 years, from the summer of 1884 to the summer of 1886, he worked as the principal and really the sole teacher at the Whitney Institute in Bermuda. And this is where he met his wife, Helen, and they became engaged. In 1886, at the age of 19, he moved to New York City with hopes of gaining employment with Edison. In his first application, he wrote, "Do not know anything about electricity, but can learn pretty quick." To which Edison replied, "Have enough men who do not know about electricity." So he was at first unsuccessful. However, he persevered, and within a few months was hired for a semi-skilled position as an assistant tester for the Edison Machine Works, which was laying underground electrical mains in New York City at that time. By late 1886, at the age of 20, he was working directly for Edison in his New Jersey lab as a junior technician on a broad range of projects solving problems in chemistry, metallurgy, and electricity. And a year later, in 1887, at the age of 21, he was appointed head chemist. While working at Edison's lab, he became good friends with Arthur Kennelly, who was in charge of Edison's electrical work. That they were good friends is apparent because when Reginald's first son was born, he named him Reginald Kennelly Fessenden. And he was always known then as Ken Fessenden, but that's where the connection comes for his son's name. In August of 1890, Edison was forced to lay off most of his lab employees, including Reginald. Not too fazed by this, Reginald and Helen, who was his engaged bride from Bermuda, were married in New York. And in September 1890, shortly afterwards, Reginald began working for George Westinghouse in the plant where Westinghouse produced electrical generators. And he was there for 2 years. And then he took a job in Indiana at the university, at Purdue University. It was a newly created position for a professor of engineering, electrical engineering, and that was when he was 25. While he was at Purdue, George Westinghouse personally asked him to help with the lighting for the Chicago World's Fair, which Westinghouse had the contract for. And he got to know George pretty well. And in June of 1893, Westinghouse personally recruited him for the newly created position of Chair of Electrical Engineering at the Western University of Pennsylvania. And so he was at the University of Pennsylvania, the Western University of Pennsylvania, which became the University of Pittsburgh. He was there for 7 years, from 1893 to 1900, sort of from ages 25 to 33. It was there that he made a pitch to the U.S. Weather Bureau showing them how to do wireless telegraphy. And they were so impressed that they offered him a job, and he went to work for the U.S. Weather Bureau in early 1900. The work in 1900 took place on Cobb Island in the Potomac River, about 50 miles south of Washington, D.C. And during that year, he successfully demonstrated wireless telegraphy by sending Morse code 50 miles to Arlington, Virginia. And then on December 23rd, 1900, he also recorded his first success in wireless telephony, transmitting speech over a distance of about 1 mile between two 15-meter masts on Cobb Island. So that represents the first transmission of voice, and that was December 23rd, 1900. However, even though his contract with the Weather Bureau was extended, the Weather Bureau chief, Willis Moore, started to pressure him to sign over a half share of his patents. And he refused. And so they made it difficult for him, and come 1902, he resigned from the Weather Bureau. His search for financing brought him into contact with Mr. Walker and Mr. Givens, two wealthy Pittsburgh businessmen, in late 1902, and resulted in the creation of NESCO, the National Electric Signaling Company, and this, of course, was the subject of the video that you saw today. Now, the work that took place, or his involvement with NESCO, actually was over a period of about 8 years. So from really the late 1902 till late 1910, early 1911, so eight years and a bit. You don't really get that impression necessarily from the video. You think it happened pretty quick, but actually there was a significant period of time. The early part of the work was spent building the towers at Brant Rock and later at Machrihanish in Scotland. It was in late 1905 that Reginald decided to send Mr. Armour to Machrihanish to properly tune that station and and give it transmitting capability, because at that point it was just receiving. And the breakthrough came in early January 1906 when Armour wired back that the Brant Rock signal had been received by Machrihanish. And so that was really the first demonstration of two-way wireless telegraphy transatlantic. Okay. Now there's a marvelous 1995 paper written by Dr. Jack Belrose, a longtime scientist with the Communications Research Center in Ottawa. Are any of you familiar with the work of Jack Belrose or some of his writings?
Heard the name.
Yeah, Jack Belrose was without a doubt the biggest promoter of Reginald's claim to fame. And he does it from a very knowledgeable technical background. He's written a couple of marvelous papers through the 1990s. The one I was reading through as I prepared my comments was entitled Fessenden and Marconi, Their Differing Technologies and Transatlantic Experiments During the First Decade of this Century. It outlines in some detail the development of the technologies for both the transmitting and the receiving of signals in the period 1900 to 1910. According to Belrose, by the summer of 1906, the Alexanderson high-frequency alternator, which is referenced there a little bit, developed by General Electric for Fessenden, was installed at Brant Rock. And when Fessenden and his assistants made some improvements to that, they were able to generate pure continuous wave, which then became the basis really for voice transmission. It made possible, through that summer of 1906, it made possible a number of voice transmission demonstrations in the Boston area. One such demonstration in the fall was from Brant Rock to a schooner offshore, a relatively short distance, but they demonstrated it. Next, in the fall of 1906, a new station was constructed at Plymouth. And during the fall of 1906, regular radio telephone communication was maintained between the two stations, Brant Rock and Plymouth. And so they were quite used to sending voice back and forth through that fall of 1906. And about midnight in November of 1906, Mr. Stein at Fessenden's Brant Rock station was telling the operator at the Plymouth station how to run the high-frequency alternator. And as I said, it was usual for these two operators to use speech over this short distance. However, his voice was heard by Mr. Armour at Machrihanish with such clarity that there was no doubt about the speaker, and the station logbooks confirmed this report. And so this is the first recorded transatlantic transmission of speech. And that was in November of 1906. I'm surprised that wasn't referenced in the video, frankly, because that's really quite incredible. Fessenden's equipment was working exceptionally well. This is all from Belrose. Fessenden's equipment was working exceptionally well in the early hours of that morning, and the echo of the telegraphy signals from the Scotland station could be clearly heard 1/5 of a second later, having traveled the long way around the Earth. So there's a really interesting observation. Unfortunately, about 3 weeks later, the Machrihanish Tower was destroyed in a storm and was never rebuilt, so the transatlantic work could not continue after early December 1906. However, on Christmas Eve, Reginald and his colleagues presented the world's first wireless broadcast of voice, because they needed some kind of a publicity thing, from his transmitter at Brant Rock to operators on board both U.S. Navy and United Fruit Company ships equipped with Fessenden's wireless receivers at various distances over the South and North Atlantic and in the West Indies. And that was what we saw on the video. Unfortunately, this technical success in the 4 years from 1906 to 1910, NESCO was unable to attract a buyer for the communications system, and in January 1911, Fessenden was served with the injunction. So that's kind of the timing of what we saw in the video. I was reading another source that said that the real problem here was that Gibbons and Walker, his financial backers, really didn't understand the business. They didn't understand that he didn't have a system. What he was developing were components. And of course, in the video, you hear Reginald saying, well, the money's to be made by selling the components, not the system, because the system didn't exist really as a system. And so, but Gibbons and Walker didn't get that, and which is why they became impatient and eventually locked him out. So he was served with an injunction and began litigation that lasted, they said 20 years, I read 15 years, but I've seen various estimates. So the settlement was reached in 1926 or 1928, but eventually there was a settlement, and he did recoup some losses. Now, although he was denied access to his NESCO patents for many years, he continued to invent for the remainder of his life. And, Murray talked about the fact that there were something like 500 patents. Things like sonar, a fathometer to detect the depth of water, turboelectric drive to power ships, the first gyro compass, a first TV receiver, ultrasonic methods for cleaning, carbon tetrachloride, tracer bullets. I mean, it's an incredible list of things that he invented. He even set to work to see if his echo finder could be used as a geophysical tool, which is really the beginnings then of seismic exploration. So it's really quite remarkable. Now, Fessenden was not only a prolific inventor, he was also a decent classical scholar. And in 1923, he published this book. I was able to get, my oldest son got me a copy of this off eBay a number of years ago as a Christmas present. The title of this is called The Deluged Civilization of the Caucasus Isthmus. This was Fessenden's attempt to explain the biblical flood story, the Noah flood story. And actually it makes a lot of sense. So you can go up and have a look at that. One of the things that's interesting to me about this particular publication is that there is some writing in the front here in Reginald's own hand, some errata comments about things that needed to be fixed in the manuscript. But you're most welcome to come up and have a look at this. Maybe some last remarks about the family. As I said, his father, Elisha Joseph Fessenden, was born in the U.S. in Michigan in 1837, but was brought back in his teen years to the Eastern Townships. And the money was somehow found for him to go to McGill, and eventually he became a minister. In 1887, at the age of 50, he went to England and was invited to preach a sermon in Westminster Abbey during Queen Victoria's Jubilee year. He was the first McGill graduate to occupy the pulpit of Westminster Abbey. So there you are. And on this same visit, he sat for an unfinished portrait of the Mayor of Canterbury, who was of Fessenden descent and had died before its completion. In 1893, he relocated the family to Ancaster, Ontario, a small village near Hamilton, where he became rector of St. John's Anglican Church. And he died there a few years later in January of 1896 at the age of 58. Raby claims that it was by suicide brought on by the depression over financial concerns and also the suicide death of his youngest son, Victor, one of Reginald's brothers. So there may have been some depression in that family. Some have said that, there's a connection between genius and other things, but maybe there's some evidence here. Reginald's father also had an interest in the family genealogy and is credited with compiling much of the information on his branch of the family into these 2 volumes, which I referred to earlier. Now, Reginald's mother deserves mention. She was born in the Eastern Townships. She grew up in a home where loyalism and devotion to all things British was strong. She also grew up in a period, as I've said before, where it was not at all clear that Canada would survive as a country and might very well end up annexed to the U.S. She identified strongly with Queen Victoria, and by the 1890s had begun to dress like her. She joined the League of the Empire and a number of historical societies, and in 1897, shortly after her husband died, and while Reginald was still in his university phase in Pittsburgh, she mounted a vigorous public campaign to combine imperialism, patriotism, and education through the establishment of an Empire Day in Canada's schools. The scheme found wide acceptance, and Empire Day was first observed in 1898 in Dundas, Ontario, on the last school day before the 24th of May, which was Queen Victoria's birthday. And it's still in existence today, although we don't call it Empire Day anymore. She was fanatically anti-American, although interestingly enough, her husband was an American, and Reginald worked in America, but she was fanatically anti-American, although she frequently visited Reginald in Massachusetts and wrote a series of columns entitled Breezy Bits from Boston that appeared in the Hamilton Spectator between July of 1908 and March 1909, towards the end of Reginald's NESCO period. For some years after her death in 1918, and she died at the age of 75, the IODE, the International Order of Daughters of the Empire, held Empire Day services at her gravesite at St. John's Anglican Church in Ancaster. And in 1928, they installed a commemorative plaque that recognizes her as the founder of Empire Day. There's a public school in Ancaster called the Clementina Fessenden Public School. Clearly, she was a very determined woman, and clearly Reginald was his mother's son in this regard. So you can see where it comes from. I think I'm going to just move to some concluding remarks here. Of course, I never met Reginald Fessenden. I couldn't have. He died 11 years before I was born. While my branch of the Fessenden family and his branch are distant on the family tree, geographically, they were contemporaries in southern Ontario from 1875 to at least the 1940s. It was my great-grandfather, Albert Fessenden, who was a fifth cousin of Reginald's, who brought our branch to Canada in 1875 when he moved to London, Ontario from Port Huron in Michigan. And then in 1890, he moved our family to Toronto. My great-grandfather, who was also interested in family history, was aware of Reginald's family. And there's a family story that he attempted to meet with Reginald's mother, Clementina, sometime between 1900 and 1910, but was refused because he was an American. So. However, my great-grandfather did correspond with Uncle Cortez, who was at that time in Peterborough, and I actually have some correspondence between them. As I indicated, my awareness of an interest in Reginald began in 1967 when Doreen and I honeymooned in Bermuda. Learning about him was to some degree about developing a reasonably informed answer to the question, are you related to Reginald Fessenden? So it was a little self-defense there. Over the years, Doreen and I have visited Reginald's tomb in Bermuda on 3 occasions. We've located and viewed his Bermuda home, Wistow. We visited the Brome County Historical Society Museum in Knowlton, Quebec to see the Fessenden display, which is located just across the street from the small house where he was born in 1866. And as I said, we visited Trinity College in Port Hope, where he spent a few years of his life. However, with regard to much of Reginald's life story and his scientific and inventive genius, I rely on the same sources in the public domain that are available to you. So I'll maybe conclude with some quotes from one of Jack Belrose's papers. Fessenden's continuous waves, a new type of detector, and his invention of the method, as well as the coining of the word heterodyne, were the first real departure from Marconi's damped wave coherer system for telegraphy, which other experimenters were merely imitating or modifying. These were the first pioneering steps towards radio communications and radio broadcasting. Today, heterodyning is fundamental to the technology of radio communications. And some historians consider that Fessenden's heterodyne principle is his greatest contribution to radio science. While he never graduated from university, his capacity for self-education was remarkable. And so you could ask the question, where did the genius come from? Well, clearly his drive and determination came from the Trentham side. Reginald could properly be described as a monomaniac with a mission, and the same could be said of his mother in a different sphere. The interest in science and engineering probably came from both sides of the family. His uncle Cortez taught mathematics and physics. Reginald also had a great uncle named Cortez Smith Fessenden, who was a civil engineer and who was the Surveyor General of the Dakota Territories in the 1880s, and for whom the town of Fessenden, North Dakota is named. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the town of Fessenden, North Dakota, but that was Reginald's great uncle. So that, on a personal note, I find it interesting that Reginald's work at Brant Rock during the NESCO period took place so close to the Massachusetts Bay, where his Fessenden ancestors had arrived some 270 years prior. You wonder what they would have thought.
I'd be prepared to take some questions.
Yeah, I've got it. Let me get the ball rolling. I have a question. Whenever you see a picture of Reginald standing
Right.
with a group of men, he's
Yep.
head and shoulders above everyone else. Do you have any idea how tall he actually was?
The references I've seen, and it's Jack Belrose who commented on this, said that he was well over 6 foot. Now, he didn't say 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", but there is a picture in, I think it's in Ravi, that shows him standing with a group of people, and he's head and shoulders taller than everybody. Now, clearly they didn't cast the right guy in the video. Oh, yes. I repeat the question.
Yeah.
No, he had a red beard.
Oh, he had a red beard, yes.
Yeah, flaming red beard.
Flaming red beard.
I had a question there too. Like, I find it very fascinating with Fessenden with the telegraphy portion of it. And at that particular time, there was that race with Marconi. And I know Marconi, they call him was it the father of radio or some title like that?
Right.
And I was reading a book in 1950 to 55. That title was taken away because he was using 15 of Tesla's patents.
Right.
You know, so I just try to remember the Fessenden part, you know, with the telegraphy seems a lot more logical and honest, you might say.
Right.
Where Marconi, like a lot of the people in those days, seemed to be a pirate, so to speak, you know, where they would
Yeah.
try to embellish themselves, and his transmission, you know, I'm a radio amateur ham, and nowadays it's kind of considered, I don't think it could have been possible with the equipment and the times and the situation and everything, so. But do you remember because it's similar times, I know there was that
Yeah.
mentioned, so.
So the question was really the sequencing and the timing of Marconi's, and to some degree also the quality of the kind of
Yeah.
approach, technical approach that Marconi used vis-a-vis Fessenden. And again, I'll refer back to Belrose, who describes this very well in that paper that's accessible on the internet. You can call it up, and where he looks at the difference in technology between Fessenden and Marconi in that 1900 to 1910 period. And the difference in technology was both on the transmitting side as well as on the receiving side. Belrose doesn't quote clearly and say that what Marconi claimed to do he could never have done, but he does kind of lead you to think that maybe there's something a little fishy in the stuff. You know, you get me here way out of my area of science knowledge, but you know, just basing it on what I've read. The real key here was both in the detection technology as well as in the transmission technology. And the original transmission technology was what was called spark gap, as opposed to continuous wave. And even some of Fessenden's early work was spark gap in terms of, rather than continuous wave. It was only when he got General Electric working on developing the high frequency alternator that they started to generate continuous wave, and when you could really be sure that you were transmitting. Continuous wave, as I understand it, was absolutely required for voice, not necessarily required for telegraphy, although the quality of the continuous wave was much better. But there was also a difference in the reception. And I guess the early receivers were based on this thing called a coherer, which
Not very good.
which was not predictable and not reliable. And then Fessenden, sometime in that early 1900 period, developed this what he called a liquid barator, which was a little better at receiving, but it wasn't really until the heterodyne concept was manufactured and the diode tube was available that it really started to work. So
Thank you very much.
at least that's what I understand.
Oh.
So you mentioned Fessenden worked on lighting with George Westinghouse for the World's Fair.
Yes.
Tesla also worked on that very project. Is there any documentation to suggest that Fessenden and Tesla may have collaborated on radio together, or maybe exchanged ideas over a cup of coffee or something like that?
I never saw that. I didn't see any evidence of that. The description I saw around the help to Westinghouse with the lighting was that he worked out ways to get around Edison's patents.
Yes, so did
Because
Tesla.
Edison had patented the light bulb, but he needed to get around that patent in order to provide, Westinghouse needed to get around the patents in order to provide. So
Yeah,
that was my understanding of how he helped him.
yeah. Tesla did the same thing as well too. He was coming up with his own. He basically invented the modern day fluorescent light
Right.
for the World's Fair. So I wouldn't be surprised if their two paths hadn't have crossed in that.
I've never seen any reference to it, but it's certainly possible. They certainly were contemporaries.
Okay, thank you.
Did Mike the cat provide his whiskers?
Not that I'm aware of. Yep.
Do the Belrose papers, do they describe in some detail the transmission and receiving equipment that he was using?
Yes. Yeah. The question was, does the Belrose papers describe in some detail, some technical detail, the receiving and transmitting equipment? And the answer is yes. They're very good papers.
Do you know what frequency, like that high frequency generator, was it somewhere around 100 kilohertz or something like that? I don't remember.
My understanding, again, going back to what I read, was that the one that was delivered to him in the summer of 1906 by General Electric was producing at 50 kilohertz, okay? And that he was able to modify it and get it up to 75.
Oh, that's pretty low.
Westinghouse.
That's low
Westinghouse
frequency.
actually how to build that generator, didn't he?
My reading was that it was a fellow at General Electric by the name of Alexanderson, yeah. That was the one who did that building.
I see.
But again, you got me, I'm a biologist, you got me on shaky ground. Look, I invite you later to come up and look at some of these things if you're interested. I'd like to say it's just been a pleasure to have had the opportunity for me to dig into some of the technical stuff a bit more. I usually satisfied myself with just being able to understand the genealogy and say, yeah, he did something at radio. But in preparing for this, I actually was able to bone up a little bit on the technical side. Now, I think I have a much better understanding now of some of the technical details. Although I can't say I understand the physics of them.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much.